Welcome back to our Unit 6, Grade 11 ELA video series for Week 2. We are on Lesson 7. We did Lesson 6 yesterday. I'm Elisa Ruffin with Leading Educators, and I'm here to guide you through today's activities. So far, we've made a lot of progress this week. We are midway through our lineup of lessons. You've already read A Fast-Changing Society, read some questions, did reflections, and yesterday you read the first half of the Everyday Use text by Alice Walker. Today we're going to continue our first read on the back half of the text, doing some annotations, and then ultimately culminating in a summary that you're going to write. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of today, remember that you are supposed to, when you complete these lesson activities, share what you're learning with a family member, caregiver, or friend. Complete the weekly fluency activity based on directions, and do some leisurely reading of a text that you choose. The other part of our protocol that we do every day is getting our brains warmed up on that riddle of the day. Today's riddle is fairly simple in that it's only one line. So here we go. What is so fragile that saying its name breaks it? What is so fragile that saying its name breaks it? I'm going to give you some time to call people over to the screen if that's what you're doing. Avoiding Google, which I'm hoping that you're doing. Taking a beat. This is the moment where you can pause it, just in case you don't want me to spoil it for you, because I am about to reveal the answer. Our riddle of today, the answer is silence. Silence is so fragile that as soon as you say the word, you have broken it. Again, simple, but also thought-provoking. So another good one to share. The resources that you need for today. You need Everyday Use, the text, Learning Packet, Week 2, Lesson 7 Note Catcher, pen or pencil, and a smartphone or device, optional if you like to access the text digitally. As always, you want to make sure you have that lesson overview there so you know the type of exercises that you'll be doing today. As always, we're going to be reading, thinking, talking, writing, and then a closing activity to wrap up all that learning. And you're going to be capturing those thoughts and your recordings in the note catcher. And you're just going to pay attention to whatever the directions say to let you know where you're supposed to record those things. Your lesson targets for today are the same as the day previous because you are still doing your first read. So I can read and summarize the background and plot of Everyday Use, and you can record ideas and questions about the characters and events as you read the story. Don't forget the essential question for the unit. You want to keep that in mind as we're reading. What do stories reveal about the human condition? So always keep that in the forefront of your mind. And then for this particular text, you want to make sure that you're also keeping in focus the guiding question. What factors lead a person to accept, reject, or feel neutral about his or her heritage? Again, a really, really juicy one to talk about. Before we get to first reading the second half of the story, we're going to come in towards the middle and read another paragraph and model some annotations there. I just wanted to do a brief overview of our annotations from yesterday. So yesterday we were underlining background and setting, boxing unfamiliar vocabulary and phrases, and writing down our first impressions, thoughts, feelings, and questions. And so we did all of that. You're going to use the same protocol today, just with a different part of the text. And some things that we came up with preliminarily are that we think that this is probably set in a rural area based on how the setting is described, from the actual land to the clay. And we also talked about Maggie as a character. We meet her first and foremost and how she's described and how her sister is described. So already a compare and contrast is happening here. We're trying to figure out whether or not our first impressions of Maggie's sister are going to be true as we move on to the next part of the text. We know that Maggie looks at her sister with awe and envy, and so we're wondering what inspires that awe and envy. What puts her in that position where the world never says no to her? So is it her smarts? Is it her looks? We're hopefully going to find a little bit more about that out today. And so we're moving on to another section of the text, starting with page 770. We're going to start on line 56. And here we're going to learn a little bit more about D. So by now you've met D. And you also know that Dee's new name now is Wanjiro Liwanika Kimanjo, right? So Dee was her name that her mother gave her, but now Dee is Wanjiro. And so now we're picking up in a part of the story where the back and forth over her new name and what she's been up to, and now they're in the house, and Wanjiro, aka Dee, is going to make a request of Mama. That's where we're starting. Remember, we're underlining background and setting. We are going to be boxing any unfamiliar vocabulary or phrases, and we're also going to be writing our thoughts and feelings and questions. So let's read. Mama, Wanjiro said, sweet as a bird, can I have these old quilts? I heard something fall in the kitchen, and a minute later the kitchen door slammed. Why don't you take one or two of the others, I asked. These old things was just done by me and Big D from some top your grandma piece before she died. No, said Wanjiro, I don't want those. They are stitched around the borders by a machine. That'll make them last better, I said. That's not the point, said Wanjiro. These are all pieces of dresses Grandma used to wear. She did all this stitching by hand. Imagine. She held the quilt securely in her arms, stroking them. Some of the pieces, like those lavender ones, come from old clothes her mother handed down to her, I said, moving up to touch the quilts. Dee, Wanjiro, moved back just enough so that I couldn't reach the quilts. They already belonged to her. Imagine, she breathed again, clutching them closely to her bosom. The truth is, I said, I promised to give them quilts to Maggie for when she marries John Thomas. She gasped like a bee had stung her. Maggie can't appreciate these quilts, she said. She'd probably be backward enough to put them to everyday use. All right. So, first and foremost, underlining background and setting. Since we're coming kind of leaping back into the middle of the text, we need to orient ourselves as to where we are in the story. So we know now that Wanjiro and Mama are having a conversation about quilts that Wanjiro have just kind of rediscovered. You also know, too, that she's been looking at some other things, eyeballing some other things in the house that she thinks she wants to take as well. So they're having this conversation in the house. They're not in the kitchen, though, because Mama says that she hears something fall in the kitchen. So who's in the kitchen? We'll find out a little bit later. So one of the things that I notice as I look at some of the dialogue back and forth and observe Wanjiro's behavior, she definitely seems to be acting like someone who's used to getting her own way. The fact that she'd go back and forth with her mother, even when her mother says, maybe you shouldn't have those and I've promised them to your sister. She's like, no, these are mine. And then she goes on to mention that she doesn't think Maggie knows their value and she won't even know what to do with them, and she'd be foolish enough to use them every day like they're nothing. So again, if we think back to our annotations from yesterday and the questions that we were asking ourselves about whether or not Maggie's sister Dee feels entitled or behaves that way, I'm starting to get the impression that maybe she does. And then we also get a snapshot into how she feels about Maggie, right? So if you look at the term that we've boxed here, backward is another way of saying unsophisticated or not as advanced, maybe even not as smart. So she goes so far as to say that Maggie is backwards, and so she's not going to appreciate the quilts and maybe she shouldn't have them. So everyday use is another term. It seems pretty, straightforward, but just to clarify, it just means that something is common, it's not special. And so Wanjiro is saying that her concern is that if Maggie gets these quilts, she won't even treat them as special. She'll just use them every day like regular blankets. So now that we have modeled the first read part 2, you're going to read the remainder of the text and do the same. And as we said before, we're going to record your learning in the talk, write section there. You are going to talk about why would a quilt be considered a good heirloom, or what could it symbolize, and then you're going to do your summary. And then you're going to talk to a family member, friend, or caregiver about whether or not you agree with Mama's decision, and you find out what Mama's decision is as you continue to read. If you have any questions, as always, you can email your teacher for support, pause or replay this video anytime you need additional coaching from me. And then again, remember to complete all of the listed activities after you're done with the lesson for today. So sharing your learning, completing the reading fluency, and doing at least 20 minutes of additional reading of a text of your own choice. So you guys are all set and ready to go for completing these activities. I know that you guys are more than prepared to do so. And I'll see you back again tomorrow.